Automating with plugins in Pro Tools is basically the same as working with volume or pan or mute, except there are a couple things you want to do in terms of setup with the plugins just to make it easier. First of all, I just want to take a look at the automation window, and you'll notice there's the plugin enable button, which needs to be enabled if you want to do some automation with plugins. We're going to add a plugin to this track. Now remember, automation with plugins in Pro Tools works only when you're using a plugin as an insert. So let me open up the inserts column for this track, and let's add a reverb plugin to this track. So the way it works is any of these parameters here can be automated. In other words, you can record their moves and play it back and it'll follow their moves. The way we want to enable this plugin for automation is by clicking on the automation button. And here are all the parameters that can be automated, pretty much all the ones that you'll see on the plugin. Generally, I will take all of them, select them all, and click Add. Putting them in the right column means all these parameters will now be automated. I'll click OK, and you'll notice we'll see green everywhere around all of the parameters. That means that these parameters are automatable. The next thing you want to do is, because we're putting this effect on an entire track, we want to start by automating it with a flat or neutral state. In other words, I have this reverb, and I don't necessarily want this reverb for every clip that happens to be on this timeline, maybe on these footsteps, but not on the clip that follows it. So the best thing to do is go to the beginning of your timeline and put it in bypass mode, meaning as you play it, as long as it's in bypass, you're not going to have the effect of the reverb. So by going to the beginning, and we're going to write this across the entire track, just to establish it as having been bypassed. That way, when we have clips that we want to add it to, we just need to remove the bypass, automate it, and it's good to go. So the way we can write it to the entire track is, first of all, we want to make sure that all of these parameters are set to be automated. We'll make sure that the plugin is in bypass because that's the state that we want to write to the entire track. Put the plugin into write mode, and then we'll press play and stop. You only have to do a second, and that'll write in this automation throughout the track. We can determine that by clicking on the waveform. You can go down to the automation lanes for all these different parameters. So we'll go to master bypass. You'll notice there is a little breakpoint there. If you remember, as soon as you add a breakpoint anywhere on the timeline, other than the very first one at the beginning, that makes that timeline for that parameter automated. In other words, it'll always return to that state. If we take a look at all these other parameters, you'll see all of them are going to have a breakpoint right where I stopped recording of automation. That's because they were all in automation ready state, and so they all were recorded up to this point. If I put this into read mode and I play it, if I hit bypass, it'll stay bypass. As soon as I press stop, it jumps back into bypass. If I play it again and I adjust one of these parameters, notice the parameter just bounces right back. Why? Because that automation or that parameter has been written to that value across the timeline. For an EQ, it's a little bit different in terms of writing a neutral state across the entire track, because with an EQ, as long as your EQ is flat, meaning all these points are at the 0 line, not up, not down. As long as everything's at 0, it's the same thing as being bypassed. So with EQs, I generally just write it across the track as being flat. So once again, I want to send all of these parameters over to the right column, meaning they're all automatable. You'll notice little green dots everywhere, meaning they're all ready to be automated. And go to the beginning. And again, I'm going to do the same thing I did before, put it into write mode and write a second or two, but that'll write it across the entire track. So again, the EQ is flat. We're going to the top of our timeline. We're putting this into write mode. Make sure plugin is enabled. And we're going to press play for a bit and stop. And again, if I go down to the automation lanes for these various parameters, you'll see that little breakpoint right there. That means that we've written automation to the timeline for this plugin. So if I put it into read, if I make any adjustments, they just bounce right back to their natural state. And that's what we want to do. So when you're working with plugins and automation, you do want to write out to the entire track the plugin in some sort of neutral state, whether that be bypass state or, in the case of an EQ, just in flat state. So it's not going to color the sound if you don't want it to be colored. So let's write some automation to this track. What we're going to do is try to create the effect of the footsteps starting in the distance and walking towards us. The way we can do that is we can automate the wet-dry level. So as the steps get closer, we'll move this level here from wet to dry, making it come from a distance to being closer. So to start writing automation, what we want to do is make sure automation for the plugin is engaged. Make sure our parameters on the plugin are ready for automation. Put our track into latch or touch. I'm going to go with touch. It's not going to matter because for what I'm doing, I'm going to be holding the control for the entire time, so it won't make a difference. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to open the automation lane for this plugin. So I can do it just in the main timeline by going down to here, and we'll switch to wet dry. But another way you can do it, if you want to be able to see the waveform as well, is we'll switch this back to waveform. I'm going to click this little arrow here, and it opens up another automation lane. And you can open up as many as you want, and you can choose what you'd like to see in those lanes. So if I go to this drop down, we'll choose wet dry, and this is the current wet dry level. And I could do that for other parameters if I wanted to see them. Or you don't need to have this opened either. I'm just doing it so we can see it as I do this. Okay, so I'm going to go back a little bit and make sure we're in touch. Plugin automation set. Now I'm going to have to do two things. I'll have to turn the bypass off, and then I'll ride the wet to dry level. So I'll press play, turn bypass off. Hit stop. You notice because I'm in touch mode, as soon as I let go of this control here, the volume line pops back up to where it was before in the total wet state. If I play this back, we'll hear. You'll see the wet dry value changing as the clip plays through. So that's great, and because we have the breakpoints, we can make adjustments if we want, but to me that sounds pretty good. So what I'm also going to do is going to do something with the EQ as well, because as the steps walk closer, the reverb level is going to change. At the same time, the way our ears hear sound, as a sound gets closer to us, we start hearing it as more present. As the steps are a little bit farther away, we're going to make them less present, meaning we're going to take out some of the high end, and we'll bring in the high end as the steps approach. So what we're going to do to cut the presence of the signal and slowly bring it back in is use the low pass filter, and that's this right here. When we start recording, we need to do two things. We need to put the low pass filter in by clicking the N button. Then we need to bring the frequency down. We'll bring it down to maybe like right around here, like 400, 300. And then as the steps get closer, we'll bring this higher and higher until we've brought it all the way up. What we need to do is turn the low pass filter on by pressing the N button, and then we need to bring the frequency down before the beginning of the footsteps clip. That way, once the footsteps start, we can start bringing the frequency back up. So let's jump towards the beginning. Make sure that plugin is enabled. Press play, engage in, bring the frequency down. Okay, So let's take a look and see what that looks like. I'm going to open up another automation lane. I can drag it larger. And I'll go to footsteps, EQ7 band, low pass frequency. We can see that here is the frequency going from where we lowered it to back up to as high as it goes. I'm not quite happy with that, so let's do it again. This time we'll actually watch the automation lane, write the automation as I do it. You'll notice that the low pass filter is not in anymore because we're at a point where we had written flat EQ. If I click where the automation starts, you'll notice that the in button lights up, meaning the low pass filter has been engaged. If we open up an automation lane to look at that parameter, and that would be low pass enable, you'll see here it's not in. So as we click to that part where its line is all the way to the top, you'll notice it's in. So let's try writing this again. I'll go to the beginning, press play, put the low pass filter in, bring the frequency down before the clip starts. And that looks better because as we get all the way to the last two steps, frequency is up as high as it can go. And that seems right. Let's take a listen to it. There we go. If we did want to adjust these keyframes, we could by selecting them, hitting delete. Let's just delete all but one up here, and you can change the trajectory if you'd like, if you want it to go more gradually towards that highest 20,000 hertz. So those are the basics of plug-in automation in Pro Tools.